Listen to hockey for a moment. The sound of the blades, the scrape of a stick across the ice, the sudden crack of a shot, the crowd rising before the puck even reaches the net. It feels like hockey belongs to ice. But ice is only part of the story. Because when we look backward, the history of hockey becomes much less simple. We find people playing stick and ball games long before modern hockey existed. We find wooden sticks shaped by hand. We find communities adapting old games to new environments. We find rules being written down. We find trophies becoming symbols. We find hockey played not only on ice, but on grass. And eventually, we find a goalkeeper standing in front of a shot with an unprotected face. Until one man decided that surviving the game was more important than looking brave. And then, in 1980, we find a young American team facing one of the most powerful hockey teams in the world. That story became known as the Miracle on Ice. But even that famous moment was not really a story about ice. It was a story about people. People making choices. People making tools. People making rules. People accepting danger. People refusing to accept it. And people giving meaning to a game that had already existed in many forms. So this is not simply the history of a sport. It is the history of how humans turned cold, wood, movement, and competition into something much larger. This is the frozen history of hockey. And the strange thing is this: the farther we travel back in time, the less the story seems to be about the ice. If you search for the oldest ancestor of hockey, you quickly encounter a problem. There is no single moment when somebody suddenly invented hockey. There are much older games involving sticks, balls, curved pieces of wood, and attempts to move an object toward a target. Ancient artwork from Egypt is sometimes described as showing a game that resembles hockey. But resemblance is not the same thing as ancestry. We cannot look at an ancient image of people holding sticks and honestly say, this is modern hockey. We can say something more careful. Humans have been playing games with sticks and moving objects for thousands of years. That is important because it changes the question. Instead of asking, who invented hockey? We should ask, why did games like this keep appearing? The answer may be surprisingly human. A stick extends the reach of the body. A ball or disc gives people something to chase. A target creates a problem. And competition gives that problem meaning. These ingredients can appear in many societies without one society copying another. The games may be different. The equipment may be different. The rules may be different. But the basic human pleasure remains familiar. Move something. Protect something. Attack something. Score. Win. So the ancient history of hockey should not be imagined as a straight line running from an Egyptian tomb directly to a Canadian rink. It is better understood as a long landscape of related human games. And eventually, one of those landscapes would become especially important. Canada. In Canada, winter was not simply a season. It shaped daily life. And frozen surfaces created new possibilities. People who already knew how to skate could use those frozen surfaces for movement, recreation, and competition. But skating alone does not create hockey. You also need equipment. And equipment has a history of its own. One of the most important parts of that history is the hockey stick. A modern stick can look like a simple object. But a stick has to survive repeated impacts. It has to be shaped correctly. It has to be balanced. And before industrial manufacturing, somebody had to make it by hand. Mi'kmaq craftspeople in Nova Scotia became renowned for producing strong wooden hockey sticks from single pieces of wood. Their sticks became an important part of hockey's material history and were sold well beyond the communities where they were made. That story matters, because sports history is often written through famous players. But players cannot play without objects. Someone makes the stick. Someone prepares the ice. Someone builds the goal. Someone creates the rules. Someone repairs the equipment. And someone teaches the next generation how to use it. The history of hockey, therefore, belongs not only to the people whose names appear in record books. It also belongs to craftspeople. And this is where wood becomes one of the central characters in our story. Before hockey became an industry, it was material. Wood, leather, metal, ice, human hands. The modern game would eventually become faster, safer, and more technologically advanced. But underneath all of that technology is an older idea. A person takes a piece of the natural world and shapes it into a tool for play. At some point, informal play needs structure. People need to agree about the size of the playing area. How many players? Where is the goal? What counts as a foul? What object should be used? What happens when two sides disagree? This is where hockey begins moving from a collection of games toward an organized sport. One important milestone came in Montreal on March 3rd, 1875. At the Victoria skating rink, James Creighton and his teammates played what Parks Canada identifies as the first indoor public hockey game. Over the following 2 years, Creighton helped combine important elements of the emerging sport: sticks, goals, skates, playing objects, and standardized rules, and promoted the game publicly. That does not mean Creighton suddenly invented every stick and ball game that came before him. He did something more historically useful. He helped organize. And organization changes games. Once rules are written down, the game can travel. A player can move to another city and still understand the basic rules. A club can play another club. A competition can produce a winner. And a winner can become part of a record. That is one of the great transformations in sports history. A game stops belonging only to the people playing it. It begins to belong to institutions, clubs, leagues, associations, newspapers, spectators, and eventually, history. Rules create memory. Imagine playing a sport where nobody agrees on the rules. The game might still be exciting. But it becomes difficult to compare yesterday with today. A sport needs memory. Rules provide part of that memory. They tell players what the game is supposed to be. They tell officials what to enforce. And they allow spectators to understand why one action matters more than another. As organized hockey spread, the game became increasingly recognizable. The rink became a defined space. The goals became standardized. The playing object became more consistent, and the rules became part of the identity of the sport. This process was not perfectly clean. Sports rarely are. Rules change, equipment changes, different organizations disagree, and players find ways to exploit whatever the rules allow. But that is precisely why sports history is interesting. The game is never completely finished. Every generation inherits something. Then it changes it. Sometimes the change is dramatic. Sometimes it is almost invisible. A small rule, a different stick, a safer piece of equipment, a new way of protecting the goal. Over decades, those small decisions accumulate. And eventually, the game our grandparents knew can look completely different from the game we know. But one thing remains. People still gather around a frozen surface. They still chase the same basic idea: get the object past the other side. A sport becomes even more powerful when it learns how to remember its winners. In 1892, Lord Stanley of Preston, Canada's Governor-General, purchased a silver bowl for 10 guineas and donated it as a trophy for the Championship Hockey Club of the Dominion of Canada. It became known as the Stanley Cup. At first, it was not the enormous structure familiar today. It was a simple silver bowl. The original trophy was called the Dominion Challenge Cup. Stanley Cup began as a nickname and eventually became its permanent name. The first champion was the Montreal Amateur Athletic Association in 1893. But the trophy became more than a prize. It became a memory machine. Names were added. Champions became part of the object. And the object carried those names into the future. That is something sports do remarkably well. They turn temporary victories into permanent symbols. A game lasts an hour. A season lasts months. A championship lasts one moment. But a trophy can outlive everyone who lifted it. The Stanley Cup, therefore, represents another stage in hockey's evolution. The game is no longer just something people play. It has become something people remember, something they can inherit, something they can dream about before they are old enough to understand what winning it means. The ice may disappear when spring arrives. The game may end, but the trophy remains. Here is another reason the story cannot simply be called the history of ice. Because hockey does not belong exclusively to ice. Field hockey developed its own enormous international history. And in India, the sport became a national sporting tradition. Indian teams won Olympic gold in 1928, 1932, and 1936, helping establish a remarkable period of dominance. One of the great names of that history was Dhyan Chand. His story belongs to grass, not frozen water. A field, a stick, a ball, an extraordinary control. That distinction matters. When people hear the word hockey, they may immediately imagine skates. But the word can describe different sporting traditions, different surfaces, different equipment, different cultures, and different histories. So the history of hockey is not one straight road. It is a network. Some paths lead across frozen lakes. Others lead across grass fields. Some stories lead to Canada. Others lead to India and beyond. And all of them remind us of something important. A sport is not defined only by its equipment. It is defined by the people who give that equipment meaning. Now return to the ice. Return to the goal. And imagine standing there without a mask. A shot is coming toward you. You have gloves. You have pads. You have a stick. But your face is exposed. For a long time, that was part of the reality of professional hockey. And then came Jacques Plante. But there is an important correction to the popular story. Plante did not invent the goalie mask. Elizabeth Graham wore a fencing mask while playing goal for Queen's University in 1927. Clint Benedict later wore a leather face protector in 1930. Plante came later. What made Plante different was not being the first person to think of protecting the face. It was what happened when he refused to stop using protection. November 1st, 1959. Madison Square Garden. Montreal Canadiens against the New York Rangers. A shot from Rangers forward, Andy Bathgate, struck Plante in the face. Plante left the ice for repairs. Then he returned wearing the fiberglass mask he had already been using in practice. The Canadiens won 3-1. And Plante told his coach, Toblake, that he would not continue playing without the mask. The coach had opposed it, but the result was difficult to argue with. The mask stayed, and the idea spread. This is more than an equipment story. It is a story about courage. We often imagine courage as accepting danger, but sometimes courage means refusing unnecessary danger. For years, a bare face could be interpreted as toughness. The mask could look like weakness. Plante challenged that idea. He did not make the game less serious. He made it possible to play the game without pretending that injury was part of the point. And eventually, the mask became something else. It became identity. Goalies began painting their masks. Some became works of art. A piece of protective equipment became a canvas. Again, hockey changed because a person made a choice. Not because the ice changed. Now move forward 21 years. Lake Placid, 1980. The United States Olympic hockey team was young. The Soviet team was powerful. The Soviets had won 4 consecutive Olympic gold medals entering the tournament. The American team was made up of amateur hockey players and was the youngest team in the tournament. The matchup was therefore about more than one game. It was about expectation. The Americans were not supposed to win. But hockey has always contained a strange possibility. The possibility that expectation can be wrong. On February 22nd, 1980, the United States faced the Soviet Union in the semifinal. The Americans fell behind. Then they came back. With the score 3-2 entering the third period, the young American team scored twice. Final score, United States, 4. Soviet Union, 3. The moment became known as the Miracle on Ice. But there is an important detail that sometimes disappears beneath the legend. The Americans had not yet won the gold medal. 2 days later, they played Finland. And they won again. 4-2. That victory secured the gold. The distinction matters because history becomes more powerful when we keep its shape intact. The Miracle on Ice was the shocking semifinal victory over the Soviet Union. The gold medal came after the victory over Finland. 2 games, 2 moments, 1 championship. But why did the first game become so much bigger than hockey? Because people saw themselves in it. A young team, a powerful opponent, an unexpected result. And a moment when a prediction seemed to collapse in front of millions of viewers. The players were not thinking about becoming symbols. They were trying to win a hockey game. That is often how history works. People live through an ordinary moment. Later generations decide what the moment meant. The players saw the puck. The crowd saw a possibility. The country saw something larger. And decades later, we remember the ice. But once again, the ice was only the stage. The story was human. By this point, hockey has become almost impossible to describe with one image. It can be a frozen pond, a wooden stick, a carefully designed arena, a silver bowl, a field of grass, a goalkeeper's mask, an Olympic rink, a national memory. The sport has changed because people kept changing it. They made better sticks. They developed better skates. They changed rules. They built organized competitions. They protected players. They traveled. They carried the game across borders. And they created traditions. That is why the history of hockey should not be reduced to the question of who invented it. Invention suggests a single moment. History is rarely that simple. Hockey emerged through accumulation. Games became organized. Equipment became specialized. Rules became standardized. Communities developed their own traditions. And important people became symbols of larger changes. James Creighton represents organization. Mi'kmaq craftspeople represent craftsmanship and material history. Lord Stanley represents institutional memory. Dhyan Chand represents hockey beyond ice. Jacques Plante represents the transformation of safety and equipment. The 1980 American team represents the way a sporting event can become cultural memory. None of these stories is the whole history. Together, they reveal something more interesting. A sport is a human system. The ice does not write the rules. The ice does not carve the sticks. The ice does not decide what counts as bravery. The ice does not choose the champion. People do. So return now to the ice. Imagine it without the crowd, without the scoreboard, without the players, without the music, without the trophy. Just ice. Cold, silent, empty. It is difficult to look at that surface and see the entire history of hockey. Because hockey was never really contained inside the ice. The ice gave people a surface, but people gave the surface a purpose. They brought sticks. They shaped them. They invented rules. They built goals. They created clubs. They made trophies. They carried the game to other countries. They played it on grass. They stood in front of shots. They put masks on their faces. They refused to accept what had once been considered normal. And sometimes they produced moments so powerful that an entire generation remembered where it was when they happened. That is why the story of hockey is not really a story about cold. It is a story about adaptation, about making something useful from what you have, about taking a frozen river and turning it into a playing surface, taking wood and turning it into a stick, taking a game and turning it into a sport, taking danger and deciding that maybe it does not have to remain danger, taking one unexpected victory and turning it into memory. The ice was always important, but it was never enough. Without people, it is just ice. And perhaps that is the real history of hockey, not the history of a frozen surface, the history of what humans chose to do on it, and the history of what they carried away when the ice was gone.